I'm like, once I get out of here, like, I'm just going to lick the face of the nearest stranger I find on the street. Obviously, I'm not really going to do that. Just I was so desperate for some kind of human contact. Hello, 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 and welcome to Well Shit. It really is that simple. I'm Claire.
And I'm Serena. On this podcast, we help you to understand about your 12 universal needs, why they are currently not being well met,
how to meet them in ways that work for you, and how to consistently do so in quick, easy, and simple ways that fit seamlessly into your life.
We'll also help you to understand how doing so will have a positive ripple effect in literally every area of your life.
If you like what you hear, sign up for more support with meeting your needs with your weekly Universal Needs notes at theuniversalneeds.com.
And enjoy the show.
Hello, hello, hello.
Hey, everyone.
So the good news is we got it over and done with nice and early this morning.
And what was that?
Not hitting record. You would have thought by now we would have figured this out. I think the thing is that when we do this, there are so many things we're trying to think about. We need a checklist. Problem is, I think at one point we created a checklist and then just never used it.
Well, the thing is, we did use it. We had the checklist. It was on the board when we used to use the board. And then we got so good. We're like, oh, no, we got this down. We check our time. We check the thing. And
yeah.
And we were even reminded this morning.
Right.
I mean, we got called out on it. Remember to hit record.
Aww. And the funny thing is that, at least the good thing is that we did it this morning. It was very low impact.
Yes.
As you may or may not know, because of our current setup, we actually tend to record in bulk. We tend to record several back to back over a couple of days, so that when we're working on other projects, we can kind of get focused on those. We did a recording. Was it last week or the week before? Week before, I think it was. And
all the weeks combined.
We were on fire that day because we finished recording and forgot to record the outro, which, by the way, if you haven't actually listened right the way to the end of one of our podcasts, there's a little nugget at the end. I've just suddenly realized, people might be like, what outro? What's an outro? Right? We do the even after we do that's it for today kind of thing at the end. And we, there's an extra little bit at the end of the episode. So make sure you listen for that. And we forgot to record that on our last episode. So we're like, oh, okay, so we sat in to do that and we recorded it and it felt good. And we're like, should we do another one? Serena's like, yeah, because we weren't recording on the first one. But at least it was a 30-second incident rather than 30 minutes of recording, that went out the window.
30 minutes. Usually when we forget to hit record, it's that solid hour and a half episode.
Right?
We're we didn't even know where that was going, but that was amazing. And we'll never remember what that said.
Right. If you watched if you listened or watched our New Year's episode, you'll see what that looks like, because that's what happened in that one. The good thing is we have managed to make sure that we have an actual audio recording of every podcast since then. We may have recorded it once or twice, but hey,
such is life.
Anyway, that's not what we're talking about today.
Nope.
What are we talking about today?
We are talking about a big one that I think I can with confidence say affects everyone.
Absolutely. Yes.
Not a single person that I am aware of can say that they have not dealt with this. And today we're actually going to talk about trauma.
Yes. And I think you're right. I think that I don't believe there is a single person on this planet who is not affected by trauma in some way, shape or form. And especially when you understand what we define trauma as being, which is what this episode is all about, you'll understand it. But because so many people are like, well, no, I've never had any trauma in my life. And I'm like,
were you alive through 2020?
Have you been alive at all? Generally speaking, life is pretty traumatic. And I think that's the thing, is that what Serena's just said there kind of sums it up, which is that when we think about trauma, what do we think about? We think about the worst possible year in the history of in living memory. We think about the year where there were pandemics and lockdowns, and we think about these massive traumatic events, and that's not the only thing that is relevant to trauma. And so often we don't end up identifying trauma as actually being trauma, and because we don't identify it, we don't heal it appropriately. So we're doing this whole series on trauma, because I don't think we mentioned we're doing a series.
We're doing a series
today. Normally Serena reminds me of that. Like, we're doing a series on trauma. This is the first episode in our trauma series. And we're going to be covering a number of different elements in it. Today, we're just going to be focusing on what is trauma. In our next episode, we're going to be looking at, like, how do you identify it? And how do you, like, what are the kind of warning signs that show that some trauma has been present or is present? And then we're going to look about how we heal it from a needs context. So I think the first thing we need to do is just talk about, like, what is trauma?
Good place to start,
isn't
it?
helpful. And we have talked about trauma on previous episodes, but if you listen to our resilience episode, which I think was the episode where we first started talking about this, you'll hear that the execution of how we shared it was a little less than what's the word? Clear.
Punchy?
Well, it wasn't punchy. It wasn't clear. We couldn't just kind of lay it out because it was being created as we were on the podcast. Serena was looking at me to say, really? Another one? And so let's just get into a kind of general definition first. Like, what is trauma? Basically, all trauma is having one or more of our needs being negatively impacted. It's about the neglect of, the erosion of, or harm to one or more of our 12 universal needs. And trauma is experienced when one or more of our needs gets negligently impacted. Both. Negligent. We're negligent around it, or it's negatively impacted.
Just spit it out.
Yeah. Or compromise. And the more needs that are affected, the more severe the trauma is. And so this is the thing, is that when, like I said, Serena, like, we talk about trauma and Serena goes to, like, what's the worst year in living memory? That's the one that comes to mind. Everyone's like, well, everybody experienced some kind of trauma that year. Even if that was just, we weren't allowed outside. Well, like, our, like, civil liberties in that what we were used to were changed. And it was for the collective good. It was for the good of our kind of national well-being and our international well-being. We were doing it, like, we were doing those things. Those restrictions were put on us to try to keep us safe. So it was like compromising some needs to try to ensure that other needs stayed met. Or it's like, yeah, we can't just go out when we want, where we want, how we want, with who we want. And I remember there was at one point where I was like, once I get out of here, like, I'm just going to lick the face of the nearest stranger I find on the street. Obviously, I'm not really going to do that. Just, I was so desperate for some kind of human contact. I'm so desperate to be out of here right now. And I was completely on board with the restrictions that we were given, because yes, we were compromising some of the needs that we had, like, higher up on the tree, but actually it was to make sure that we physically we stayed well, that we were secure, that we were protected, and also that we were protecting people who were at more at risk, who wouldn't have, like, if I'd got when I got COVID, it didn't affect me as badly as it did other people, because I didn't have those kind of pre-existing conditions that meant that they were like seriously problematic. So I kind of went off on a bit of a tangent there. I'm like, off I went.
And I think the thing is, with especially, like, using the example of the pandemic in that period, I think people are, like, some people may not have even realized, like, that was a trauma situation for the collective,
right?
Like, and that is naming it for what it is. That was a traumatic event, and then there were traumatic events within said traumatic event, within said traumatic events, within said traumatic events. And it's easy to be like, oh, okay, yeah, I can see where that's trauma. And I think that as a culture, we're conditioned to kind of negate the traumas we experience in everyday life, and those things that it's like, that's life, this is just how things are. And a lot of times those are traumas, and if we're not identifying with them and healing from them, they're things that are going to keep getting re-triggered. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to also make a note that at the time of recording, although that technically the pandemic is over, how it's been, like, stated by the government, it's really not, because there are still disabled folks with chronic illness who are still, like, facing the consequence of the fact that it is still, it's prevalent, and we're not having the same measures and precautionary measures put in place. So it's not over. And the fact that we kind of believe it's over for some but not for others is kind of indicative of how we're not approaching this in a way which is supportive for everybody and all needs. That's an entirely separate episode. We'll come back to that another time, but I just wanted to make sure we kind of noted that. So as you may or not have heard on the episode on resilience, there eventually turned out to be 6 types of trauma. It's not where we started when we began that episode, but it's where we ended at the end. So let's just break down what those 6 different types of trauma are in order to help you to understand. And as we're going through this, I want you to just think about like how many, and okay, I was about to say, as we go through this, think about all the different things that are actually traumas for you. Now, it's very easy when we start to recognize where things are traumas, because the word trauma has a lot of charge to it. Mm-hmm. And it's very easy to kind of get overwhelmed and be like, oh my God, like I'm completely overwhelmed with all this kind of trauma that I'm that I've experienced and what have you. Now, it's important to recognize that slight traumas, which is the first one we're going to start off with, they're actually very easy to heal and resolve from. But we also want to not negate the impact that has happened to us. And I think that's the thing, is a lot of the time as we navigate day-to-day life, we ignore or negate the impact to us of these like small things that happen day to day. And in doing so all we do is we repress those things, and we repress the consequences of them. And then what ends up is they build up and build up and build up. And that's where you end up with like the straw that broke the camel's back. There's like this one tiny thing and there's this huge explosion, and someone's like, what the hell happened there? Like, I was like, there was this tiny thing. Well, yeah, but when you haven't actually dealt with or addressed all of these other little things that have happened, even if they're not related, eventually we hit kind of critical mass where it's like, boom, okay, fine. We now need to like, it all comes spelling out whether we like it or not. Yeah. So the first type of trauma, it's important to say that they're kind of split into 2 sets of 3. 3 sets of 3 would be 9. No, don't worry, I'm not adding any more to it. There are 6, there's 2 sets of 3. There's 3 in a second, we say, don't you dare. Like, I've just done the slides on this. Do not make me do more.
It's such like a
love-hate relationship.
It really is a love-hate relationship every time new content comes up, because I'm like, yes, this is good. Oh, that means there's more work. Yes, that means that it's going to get out there. Oh. So anytime she says, I don't want you to think that, like, we get off camera, I'm like, rah, 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 rah. Like, I am happy about new content.
2-hour impression.
But yeah, so we're going to stick with 6 for the time being. Who knows?
Who knows what will happen by the end of the episode? Who knows where we'll end up? But we'll start off with 6. And the 6 are in 2 groups of 3. And those 2 groups of 3 are based on how frequently something is happening, whether something's happening in the moment or whether something's happening over a prolonged period of time. Mm-hmm. So the first type of trauma is a slight trauma that's happening at a momentary level. And so this is something that is happening for a short period of time, and it's a low level trauma. It's not something that's going to be like, it's going to take you out for the next week, but it is something that has a negative impact to one or more of your universal needs. So some examples of like small, of these sort of slight traumas are getting a splinter in your finger. It's going to impact you. If you get a splinter in your finger, you don't go, oh, there's a splinter in my finger, I'm just going to go about my day-to-day life. Because every time you use that finger, every time it brushes up against something, you're going to feel it again. You got to deal with the splinter. You got to take the splinter out in order that it can heal. And this is actually, like, the splinter is such a great example of a slight trauma. Because if we don't deal with it, we don't recognize, hold on, there's a splinter in my finger, and do something like get our little tweezers and pull it out, then what ends up happening is it keeps affecting us. We get affected like 10, 20, 50, 100 times over in a day. Because if you've ever had a splinter and it like catches just on your clothes, or like even just like pressure on the other side of your finger causes you to feel that splinter again. And every time it's like, oh, ow. And it's like, and I mean, if you've ever been in a situation where you have a splinter and you don't have tweezers with you, the time between you identifying that you have a splinter in your finger and getting to the tweezers is really fucking annoying.
You're like chewing off your finger.
Yes, I'm like, can I get it? No, can I get it? Like, can somebody else get it? Like, and like every time you use the hand, you use the finger, anytime you catch it on something, anytime. And the thing about it is a splinter is a really good example, because the splinter itself is the slight trauma. But if you catch it and it pulls, then you can end up dealing with something slightly different, because more trauma is happening in that moment. You've just not got the initial injury. You're actually creating more of it. Now, obviously, splinter's tiny, so the more is going to be less. But it's not going to be as, oh, my God, I've got to have my like I've got to go and have surgery or anything like that, depending on the size of the splinter, obviously. But go ahead. I feel like you're about to jump in.
Yeah. Well, and one thing I think the splinter, I agree. It is a really good example because if you leave a splinter or you've been mucking about with it for a little bit and it gets infected because you haven't dealt with that, then you could have this little slight trauma that becomes a much bigger thing because you didn't deal with it.
The thing is that the splinter is a momentary thing if you take it out straight away. If you don't take it out straight away, it becomes sustained. And we're going to get onto slight and sustained a little bit later, but I just wanted to kind of keep the splinter in mind because when it's slight and sustained and it's not been healed, that's when the infection's likely to come in and that's when it's going to become more severe. So it's like...
So back to the splinter in a little bit.
We'll return to the splinter. Back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Super exciting episode.
But yeah, so that's like one good example. But it is a really good example because it's one of those things where that momentary thing, if you dealt with it in the moment, like honestly, if you've had a splinter and you've taken the splinter out, within like a minute of you taking that splinter out, you've totally forgotten the splinter ever existed. Most of the time. I mean, depending on how deep it is and what have you. But most of the time you take it out and it's like, oh, okay, move on with my life. I forget that I ever had a splinter. That is what we talk about. That's the reason that's like, you have to address it because once you address it, you're like, oh, cool, dealt with, moving on with my life. So first example is a splinter. Second is like hearing a news story that is something that might be shocking, but it's like a momentary thing. It's going to have an impact to you. Maybe you might feel scared because it was something that happened in somewhere that is like where you are. Not where you are, not you're scared this is going to happen to you. This is something that maybe happened. You're like, oh, that could have happened in here. Or that could have happened to somebody that I knew. It could have happened to me. Like those kind of things are things that are slight because you have that momentary kind of feeling in the moment. And again, if you do something to address that feeling in the moment, like, for example, that could happen. Well, actually, no, I've got this thing and I'm like, I feel safe here because of this, and this, or I've got a ring at my front door so I can see whether somebody comes up to my house. Like there's all kinds of different things that we can do to help address the impacted needs in that moment so that it is a momentary thing. We address it and we then move on with our lives. It depends on the news story. That's kind of a little bit more kind of amorphous because it depends on what we're talking about as to what type of trauma we're talking about, but it's a start. Another example is hearing an offensive joke. And I would say it's about hearing an offensive joke from somebody you don't know and don't have any interaction with and are probably never going to see again. So if you hear somebody, if you're out at a bar and you hear someone next to you telling an offensive joke, but you're never in that bar usually, and you're never going to see this person again, in the moment, it's going to have an impact to you. Now, what I will say with this is that hearing an offensive joke could be a slight trauma. It actually could be something that is more sustained because if it's an offensive joke because, I'm trying to think of a good example of an offensive joke that doesn't root into bigotry. And I'm finding it tough. There are things that are offensive where it's like, well, that's not funny in that moment. Now, if that offensive joke is landing on a level of marginalization that you hold, then chances are that's not going to be a slight trauma because that might be a slight and sustained trauma, as in you've heard many of these jokes and you've had many experiences of this bigotry over your life. This is the reason that when people often describe people who are educators on systemic bigotry and marginalization, they talk about like marginalization, they talk about these microaggressions. And the reality is that microaggressions only seem micro to the ones who are perpetrating them, not the people who are receiving them. Because the reason is that there have been so many of them over a period of their life that it's slight. It's not, although those moments might be a slight thing, actually it's happened over a sustained period, which means that every time it gets hit, it no longer is slight. It amps up the severity. And because it's already landing on, even if it's about, it's not something you've experienced, like you've not heard, like chances of you being a marginalized person not hearing an offensive joke rooted in that bigotry is like almost non-existent. But say, for example, that was a possibility in life, which is really not ever going to have been a possibility because it's such a big part of jokes and comedy. And if you're not watching on the thing, massive inverted commas as I say that, is that, well, yes, but it might be hitting on the same marginalization. So while it's like taking a slightly different form, it's actually hitting on the marginalization piece. That's where the impact to needs is, which means it's not slight. So this is the reason that when we talk about, like, as I said, you could talk about an offensive joke that's not rooted in bigotry. It's just somebody having a really off-color sense of humor. I don't actually know what off-color is. That's probably not a term I want to be using. Just really bad taste. There we go. Bad taste joke. But it's not rooted in bigotry, then that's one of those things that's probably a slight trauma. And if you're never going to see that person again and you're never going to be in that situation, it's going to hit you. It's probably going to hit you sideways. It's going to impact some needs. But actually, it's in that moment, and chances are relatively soon after that, as long as you address the needs that have been impacted, it won't be something that you really necessarily... The reason these things stay with us is normally because we haven't healed them. Like if something's bugging us, it's because we haven't addressed the needs that have been impacted by that. As long as we address the needs that have been impacted by that, then actually a lot of the time we move on and we probably don't give it too much further thought.
It's kind of like clearing niggles.
Yes, with our little... Who has a name now, our niggle monster from the Clearing Niggles episode. If you go back to the friendship series, he has a name now. Well, because no one gave us a name, so Serena named him.
He's Mr. Niggles.
Mr. Niggles.
He helps eat the niggles. We try not to feed him niggles.
Yes,
and don't forget his little backpack fun.
If you have no idea what we're talking about, go back and listen to some of our previous episodes. It might become clear. It may not, but more clarity maybe. But we're not going to go into that right now because otherwise this entire episode is going to derail.
So back on track. Yeah. An example of significant trauma would be like, let's say I trip and I, kind of fall and bump my head. Nothing major. Recover from it fairly quickly, but that's a little bit more than a splinter. So that
having experienced both, I can confirm. Yes.
Yes.
And obviously, we're talking about not as like so hard that you cause yourself a concussion or any like
you're not
prolonged,
profusely bleeding, hemorrhaging from the head. But I think many of it. I mean, how many times have I opened the cabinet door and just like dunk right into my head, and it's like, shit.
Yes.
But it's not affecting me much longer than the shit. There's a bump. I may throw some ice on it. And then I move about my day with a nice little egg on my forehead.
Right.
And kind of speaking to, in the last example, we were talking about hearing a news story. Now, a significant trauma would be if you were present at a traumatic event, but it didn't directly affect you. So if you were at a...
kind of witnessing a traumatic event.
If you were witnessing in the presence of it, but not directly impacted. So if you were at an event where there was some sort of emergency and you were present for that, but you weren't part of the emergency.
Yeah, a really good example for this actually was, I remember many years ago, I was at the scene, I was the first on the scene of a car accident. And I'm very good at going into kind of get shit done mode and like calling ambulance. Yeah. Like in those sorts of situations, I would be like calling ambulances and what have you. But this happened right outside a police station, which meant that very, very quickly there were police officers who were at the scene, and they then obviously at that point I'm like, okay, well, they've got that handled, like getting the ambulance there. They've got more training as far as medical support and emergency care is their response to that is probably they're going to be better trained in that than I am. So very quickly I was no longer in get shit done, take control, make sure everyone's okay mode. I was just in witness mode, and there was quite a bit of blood at the scene where it was, and I started to. I have a thing with blood. I'm not very good with blood. I've had several instances in my life where I've had injuries of significant injuries, which have caused me to bleed a lot, and I've ended up blacked out on the floor. So that is my response to blood, generally speaking, is like, bye. I'll be back in a few minutes kind of thing. And that's what happened because I was witnessing it. And I wasn't part of the accident, but also because the adrenaline that would normally kick in and like, I've got to take care, there's nobody else to take care of this situation right now. I've got to handle it. Not needing to go into that coping mode, I was able to just be where I was at as a witness to the accident. And the next thing I know, I'm like, I'm going to pass out. Someone get me a cup of tea with lots of sugar in it.
Well, it's almost like there's kind of some nuance in here. It's witnessing the aftermath of the accident, not the actual accident. We're going to get to that in the next one. Yeah. I don't think we as people, we don't necessarily think that what we're witnessing and what is around us can be traumatic. It's like, oh, well, they're in the accident. They obviously, they were the ones that were traumatized. It's like, yes, and
I was the next car, could have easily been me. And as someone who has a weird thing with blood, seeing bloods, that's going to impact me. Like, nobody did that intentionally. What are you laughing at? We're so different in this respect.
Yes, we are. Total off tangent. Stay with me for 3 seconds, everybody. All I can think of, there was like years and years ago, there was a video that was circulating social media, and it was of a little kid who was like, blood, not like, it was like one of those cute like Charlie Bit Me type of videos, and he has, I believe it was like a UK accent. Yeah. So when you just said that, all I could see was this little kid being like, blood. So sorry. Like,
anyway,
back
to
on
our
track.
regular scheduled programming ish. I mean. Yes.
At this point, you know what to expect from us. So.
And if you don't, welcome to the world of Claire and Serena and the universal need. This is
the many rabbit holes that lie in our world.
Tangents and random little squiggly doos we do along the way. Anyway, so I'm also just laughing because the third one, we have notes up when we're doing this. And obviously there's been an error when we've copied and pasted the notes because the third one is severe in a momentary period of time, but actually on my notes it says sever. That would also be a severe trauma. Like anything being severed would not be a good thing. Sorry, that's the moment I'm having. I'm like, what? Oh, hold on. No, I get like we're typo. We're good. We're good.
Not judging our spelling.
No, we're not judging our spelling. I'm just had a moment of like, whoa. I think it's also because I just watched the Netflix series You yesterday. I just kind of binge watched the last series. So that like triggered some things in me, which we're going to get to in our next episode. We'll talk about triggers later. Anyway, moving on. Number 3. I said this was going to be like more easily laid out, more clarity. We're going all around the houses. So yes, more, but not maybe as succinct as you would have appreciated it. There'll be a summary of this in the show notes, I'm sure. So no, number 3 is still a momentary thing, but it's at a much more severe level. So the example is here, as Serena was saying, is like the example of like a severe accident that you were in, but you don't have any sustained injuries, but the experience itself was severe. In that moment, it was like, having had a couple of near-death brushes myself, having those moments of like, whoa, that was nearly me not here. Actually going back to the example of when I was run over by the truck. Like, if you've not heard it, I've shared the story on many previous episodes, so I'm not going to go into the detail of it now. Basically, a sand truck reversed over me on the beach while I had noise-cancelling headphones in. And the thing is, it stopped before it did me any serious injury. But the experience of being under a sand truck and waking up with a truck tire by one head and by your feet and realizing you're about to be annihilated. And when I got out, discovering the only reason the truck stopped was because the driver had to get out to move a trash can that was in his way. I'm like, I was a trash can away from not being here right now. That was an example of a momentary but severe situation. And if I hadn't addressed it in that moment, then what I potentially would have done is I would have carried that trauma on, and that would have impacted lots of different areas of my life and in lots of different ways. But so that's an example where there was like, I was in a serious accident, but I didn't have any sustained injuries. And because I dealt with the emotional trauma in that moment and immediately following it, I didn't have that emotional trauma that then stayed with me and created PTSD around that situation.
And I have to say, in that situation specifically, for her, that was a severe trauma. For me, that was a slight trauma. Hearing about that, I wasn't there, I wasn't present, but just hearing that, I had a reaction to it. So it's
the possibility of me not being here and how close I was to me not being here.
It had a traumatic effect on me. And that's something that, like, we're in like a tough world. You got to be tough. You got to be strong. You got to be all these things. And sometimes it's like, God, no, we live in a fucked up world where fucked up things happen. And it's like, we have to, the more we can address with ourselves, like that doesn't feel right. That doesn't feel good. That feels fucked up. That gives me any sort of feels. Like,
right.
I think it's really important to identify that within ourselves. Like, that was her trauma, and we're going to get into this much more, I believe, in the next episode. But I thought that was a good place for me to kind of circle up to it, like
I think
the different layers.
Further in this, I think this episode, we're actually going to go back into that. But anyway, it's coming. It's coming. is the answer. Other examples are being a victim of a crime with no sustained injuries, and it's important to stay within this. That I would say, for example, like a crime of opportunity, like not something that is like, oh, this is going to make me feel unsafe because there's a risk this could happen again, and that affecting my security need, but just being like a momentary wrong place, wrong time, no sustained injuries, like crime of opportunity. Chances are it's never going to happen to you again, but the experience of it in that moment was severe.
Kind of like a mugging or something along those lines.
I think it depends, because I think that it's there's so much nuance when it comes to trauma. Like that's one of the tough things with like coming up with these examples, is there's so much nuance, because it depends. Like if you are living in an area where that is something that happens a lot, then your security need is that's not like just a momentary, I was in this place that I'm never going to be again, and it only happens in that area. So I'm trying to think of like I can't even think of something that's like region specific, for example. Like if I don't know okay, I'm gonna go fantasy land for a second. But if, for example, there was a country in which they had hover vehicles now, and your hover vehicle got stolen, but you don't live in that country. You go, so you return home. Your hover vehicle's never going to be stolen again because you don't have a hover vehicle back home. So I think that, and it kind of that's with the crime. It very much depends on the crime that we're talking about, because so often just the experience of having been mugged, and that's not something that is only going to exist in one area, or it's only going to happen in one place, and that impact to your security need, chances are is it's probably going to be at a more sustained level. So the chance that there might be, I'm thinking about more like an accident where somebody like hit and run, where they get they like. I'm thinking about when I was a kid. We were my mum was in a hit and run. Somebody hit her car and then drove off. So in that moment of having the car hit, like it was a severe trauma, because she didn't know, were we okay? Was the car okay? And all those sorts of things. But it wasn't something like, oh, that was something somebody intentionally did to me. I was an intentional victim. That's somebody who, for whatever reason, didn't hang around and exchange information. So it caused more of an intense, like the police had to be involved at a different level than they would be if everyone had just stayed and exchanged information, and they could have just gone through to the insurance companies. So I think that I'm very, very mindful of like, so it's one of the challenges that we have when we come up with examples for the need stuff. There's always so much nuance in here. I don't want people going, oh, well, they said on the podcast that this equals this. These are kind of generalized examples that could fall into this category or could fall into that category. But this is the reason that if people have the opportunity to work with us one-on-one, that is always the best option, because we can go, okay, based on you and your situation, what actually happened in this situation, we can look at the layers of nuance and go, well, it's this, but there's a little bit of this in here and a little bit of that in here, and this is relating to this and this is relating to that, and that's related to your history and your childhood, but this is relating to where you live or where you were visiting at the time. And that's the thing, is that I'm always very reticent when we talk about, like, we go back and listen to the let's lose the absolutes. We're really reticent to put absolutes in the podcast. You'll notice it's normally sometimes, often, occasionally, because it's not a one size fits all. There is so much nuance to all of these things. So I just want to be like, depends on the situation. I think that some of the others examples that we have on here is like surviving a natural disaster. So if like as two people who have literally survived a category 5 hurricane, and what happened was we were able to escape from the hurricane and we didn't experience damage when we returned. So there was no bodily damage to us. There was no damage to our property or anything. But I remember the experience of being in the bedroom, packing my clothes with that thing coming at us, knowing that these things can change direction and there is one path out of this island and there is a possibility we could evacuate into the path of the hurricane, going, oh my God, I may not live through this. This could be it. That moment was a moment of severe trauma for me. Like the facing my mortality of the fact that I could potentially die was a momentary trauma. Now, the rest of it, totally cool. We got through it unscathed, relatively speaking. It was intense. There was a lot of ducks and turns and winds and winding roads to get us to the point where everything was cool again. But I think that that's a better example of this, where it was something that and again, when you talk about you live in Florida, chances are things are going to come our way relatively frequent. If you live in Florida, the risk of that trauma being repeated is pretty high. If that category 5 hurricane, I remember in 1987 in the UK, we had a hurricane hit the UK. We don't get hurricanes in the UK. And comparatively with a Cat 5, I mean, it was nothing by comparison. But it was severe for us. But it was severe and momentary. It was like, this is not going to... I mean, I don't think we've had another experience like that since, because that's not something that happens there very often. So it was a momentary severe trauma. I mean, I remember being like held up in the house, and like we had these this fence that surrounded our garden with 6-foot wooden panels that were flying off and flying around like the road. Like we went back out into the garden and like we could see outside because there was no fence there anymore. So I think that those are kind of better examples, and that's the reason I realize that these are not as like, normally we like to jump in and be like punchy with our little examples and everything. There's a reason I'm talking a lot around these, is because I want you to understand that there's always nuance when it comes to these things. Nuance, boundaries, nuance. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and listen to our previous episodes. It will make sense, I think. And so there's always going to be nuance here. And I think that we want to be very careful that we're not generalizing, going, oh, in this situation, it's always this. And in this situation, it's always this. It very much depends on the individual, the circumstances, where you are, when you are, what's happening around you. And
what your past traumas have been.
Exactly. So that's severe and momentary trauma. So now what we're going to do is Serena's going to start off with the sustained trauma. So these are all of these next 3 are things that are sustained over a period of time, things that have taken place at the level that they're at, but over a prolonged period.
Yes. So the first one that we're going to talk about in this group is slight and sustained. So as Claire said, this happens over a significant period of time.
And that significant period of time could be, for example, a few days, it could be a week, it could be years. Like there's no definition of that sustained time, but the length of time that it's been sustained for will increase the intensity of it.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And especially, and you'll kind of get, if you're like kind of like, I'm not quite sure what they're talking about when we get to the examples, I think that's where it's really going to click.
Yeah.
So this is the slight and sustained, that's so many S's. The extent to which our needs are impacted are less than in the severe trauma, but it's still trauma, even though it's slight. And the fact that it's a chronic experience over a prolonged period of time causes a serious impact to our physical, mental, and or emotional well-being.
Yeah.
So a couple examples that we have for this one. The first is being involved in a toxic relationship over a period of time. And this situation is going to slowly erode your sense of self-worth.
And when we say toxic, we're talking about slight toxicities, we're talking about a severe toxic, like, remember, we're talking about slight traumas here. We're talking about lots of little comments over time that individually don't feel like they're a huge amount, but because they happen over a period of time, that's what it slowly erodes that sense of self-worth.
Yes, yeah. We're not talking in this situation about like the highly abusive situations.
Yes.
And this is a form of, I mean, I don't want to negate it that it's not abusive if you're in one of these. It can be,
again, nuance, like, because you can have like, there can be behaviors that are not abusive, but they are still toxic. So it's like, I'm doing this thing that is not supportive to me or you or our relationship, but they're not necessarily. So these can be like these small types, and a lot of the time how abuse starts is they start with the small things. Like, very rarely do people walk into an abusive situation and it's like it's as extreme when it finishes as it is when it starts. Normally it's these small slight things that happen at the beginning that don't get addressed, or they get, there's a lot of apologizing and then love bombing that happens, and that then causes someone to go, okay, it was only a small thing, so it's okay, I'm going to stay. And then it kind of gets progressively worse and more severe over time. So it can be slight, it can be abusive, it cannot be nuance. Shocking.
Always nuance. And another example that we have, which I think many people can relate to, is being in an unsupportive work environment, which creates sustained stress.
Yes.
Like going to work every day and having that little, like, and again, we're not talking about huge things that are happening, but it's just that
little digs.
That, like, and then especially in the work situation, it's probably happening from multiple different areas. And
it can be. Like, it may just be one person who's just being an asshole, who's making like little digs and little comments. Like I noticed you were late today, like you were 30 seconds late. Like it could be like those sorts of things. It could be a co-worker. It could be a manager. Like so many different ways this can show up, and the effect. If it is a manager where you then don't have the ability to go to somebody to get help, like that could be more severe because, well, now I don't have support. If it's a co-worker and a colleague who I can go and actually have this dealt with, it may seem less severe. I mean, there's nuance. There's all these different possibilities. And actually, I'm going to jump in with one other example. Let's go back to the splinter. We talked about this. The splinter example, where if we have the splinter and it's staying in our finger, and it's staying there over a significant period of time. So if you have a splinter and you get rid of it within the first couple of hours, chances are, as I said, you're going to move on, not going to worry about it anymore. But if over a chronic period of time, say you have that splinter in there for a month or 6 months or 12 months or 3 years, over a period of time, chances are that's going to get infected. And because it's the same, and this is a good example of how when slight traumas, or when traumas happen over a prolonged period of time, when they're of a sustained nature, often the net impact is much more severe. So the impact of not having had that splinter dealt with is that it gets infected, and then it needs more in order to be able to heal it than it would have done in the first place, which would have been removing the damn thing. So this is where, like, I think it's good to kind of loop back in that kind of example of the splinter we had earlier, because it's slight, but if that slight thing happens over a sustained period of time, then I think that is something that can then create more severity. So there's another example of this. I was going to do this later on in the podcast, but hey, we're here now. Let's dive on in. Another example was a woman who experienced manspreading when going on public transport. Now, if you don't know what manspreading is, Serena is doing a beautiful example right now, but you can't see her knees, so you can't really see the full experience that she would be giving. So manspreading is where a lot of the time men on public transport will take up more than their allotted space and encroach into the spaces of people around them with really little to no regard of the impact of that. So a lot of the time they'll sit with their knees really far apart, and they will often take up like half the space on either side next to them. Another great example is that irrespective of where they're sitting, taking up the full armrest if you're on a plane, or sitting with their arms such that like spread out so that you that they're basically encroaching into the personal space of the person next to them. And this woman, I think she lived in New York. She commuted every day. And when she commuted, what she would find is she would often be in this a situation where she was dealing with manspreading. And she would have to like sit like slightly, I don't know if you can see, if you're watching on the video, you'll see what I'm doing. I'm like up to one side and like at a slightly twisted angle in order that she could sit in her seat without having physical contact with this person next to her. She didn't want to have physical contact with. Now, this tends to happen, as I said, there's nuance when it comes to this.
You don't say.
Because obviously this is not just this kind of one incident that women and those who don't identify as men have in their lived experience, because manspreading is one, mansplaining is one, like I was about to say manscaping is another. That's not one.
That's a different podcast.
That's a different podcast altogether. But there are lots of this. These different, like there's another term and I can't think of it right now. Like of men,
all I can think of is manscaping now. I mean, I'm in a totally different podcast in my mind, so I'll be joining you back again later.
Yeah, so you return whenever you like. We'll be here waiting for you. Not like when like men take credit for other people's ideas or that interrupting thing that happens a lot of the time. So this is already landing on this on a situation where we're already kind of facing the impact of this marginalization that we have in not identifying as men. So I'm just going to kind of take that piece out of the equation just for a second. It is, as I said, nuance. It exists and it is relevant to this. But let's just take this one example as an isolated incident for the moment. So take it that this woman is like sitting and in an everyday. Is it that much of an inconvenience? It's not a massive one. It's a slight one because she's sitting slightly crookedly. But here's the thing. Over a significant period of time, this affected her physical, what's the word I'm looking for? Alignment, yes, thank you. That wasn't the word I was looking for, but that'll do. And she ended up having to go and get medical help because it affected her spine, it affected her musculature, because she was doing it every single day. So something that in a momentary fashion, when you look at it like moment by moment, is it that big a thing? No, it's a slight trauma in that moment because they're saying that our space is less valuable than their space, and they're causing us to sit in a position which is probably uncomfortable. So that's going to affect other needs. But actually, when you take that over a sustained period of time, when things happen over a sustained period of time, they increase in severity. And a little bit like the splinter becoming infected, this is another example where this sort of just this slight discomfort of sitting at the wrong position over and over and over again over a prolonged period of time led to incredible pain for her and medical bills that she had to pay in order to then rectify and address and heal the issue from this slight trauma. So over time, it became significant, and then eventually it actually became, I'm sure, severe for her with the extent of pain that she was experiencing, just because it was over a sustained period of time.
Wouldn't you say this would also affect the value need over a sustained period of time?
Yeah.
Because eventually, like doing
the
work we do, like it's hard not to internalize. Like every day, I have to accommodate for somebody else. Be it man, woman, non-binary,
right,
whoever. Because I've seen both sexes do it. And what really blows my mind is when somebody accommodates such behavior, such as the widespread, and that was just their normal stance. And then they double down and they're like, oh, well, I get even more room. Like, no, like I'm trying to not touch you and now you're back in my field.
Well, I think what you're speaking to is that, yes, because obviously the value need is in a momentary level, what we talked about in terms of that momentary, like, oh, you're basically saying that you having your space is more important than me having mine, even though this is my space, that you taking it's more important for you to take my space than for me to have it, and that you're worthy of that, even though it's my space. There's a whole bunch of things that happen in that moment. But when that happens over a significant period of time, this is why a lot of people who are not men actually end up internalizing this belief that we are not entitled to take up as much space. We're not entitled to, and whether that space is physical space, whether it is emotional space, whether it is like verbal space, like there's a reason that I saw something a while back about they did a piece of research on, and I'm doing this from memory, so do not quote me on this. Go and find out what the research was. If I can find it, I will put it in the show notes myself. But they were doing this research on the amount in a meeting, the percentage of time that women were speaking and men were speaking. I think they were just looking at the binary at that point. I'm not sure if they were also aware of like they took into consideration non-binary transgender individuals and genderqueer people. But from what I remember, I think they were saying they did it over a period of time, and there was never an incident where women were speaking more than men were. But the interesting thing was that the perception of the women was pretty spot on in terms of what percentage they were speaking and what percentage the men were speaking. The men were completely off. And I think that they said, I think it was the average was something like, I think it was 15% that women were speaking. 1.5. It was 15 or it was 30. It was like in that range somewhere. It was significantly less than 50%. And the thing about it is that what happened is that all of these things, when they happen to you over a sustained period, and this is what oppression does, this is what marginalization does, is that when you are encroached on, when you are diminished, when you are devalued, when you are told that you're not meant to take up space, when other people take space from you that is your space, that gets internalized as in I am less valuable and I am less worthy of taking up space, physical space, mental space, emotional space, verbal space. And so that's the reason that a lot of time in these environments women do speak less. When you then, I'm sure, and I don't know about the research on this, I don't know whether research has been done, when you then look at if it's BBIMP women, so BBIMP was an acronym that's created by According to Wheeze, which stands for Black, Brown, Indigenous and Melanated People of Colour. Melanated people, sorry. And if you took black women, I'm sure that they speak significantly less than the white women in that situation. When you look at any kind of marginalization, this is what happens, is these traumas happen over and over and over this the sustained period of time. And it then impacts how you feel about yourself, what you believe you are worthy of, what you believe that you have a right to, what you are entitled to. And it then changes how you operate within the world. So yes, it definitely is going to have an impact in terms of your value need, and a whole, like it's like your needs tree gets blown up at the roots at that point. And that's the reason that it's so important for us to start recognizing our right to exist and our right to take up space, and actually starting to do that and starting to change the dynamics in these situations, obviously where it is safe for us to do so, in order that and also where we do have privilege. Like if I'm in a space with, say, a black woman and two white guys, it's my responsibility to also be like, where I can claim the space I can claim, that's one thing, but actually it's my responsibility to also keep bringing, like asking for the opinion of the more marginalized person in the space, asking if they want to add something to it. And if they're being interrupted by the other person, jumping in and interrupting them and going, hold on a second, they were speaking. Like, making sure that we're doing what we can to rectify this, because if we don't, because of the interconnectedness between humans, if somebody else's needs are being negatively impacted, it's actually negatively impacting ours as well. Massive tangent then, but I think it was an important one. So yeah. Oh, it's my turn.
It's your turn.
I was like, I just talked a lot. Oh, it's my turn again. I'm sure that it will all balance out over time. So the next is still in this kind of sustained nature. So this is significant and is sustained. So this is the level of it's still over this prolonged period of time, but the level of the severity of the trauma is more significant. So let's look at a couple of examples of this. So living in poverty over a period of time. Now, again, poverty is a very broad term, and it depends what we are talking about with regard to this. If we are in a place where we can't afford to have a roof over our head, we can't afford to eat, those are things that are obviously much more severe in nature. But for example, being in a position where we may not have been in that situation, but there was an ever-present risk of that being the case. Like, we felt like we were one medical bill away from not being able to pay rent, and we were one medical bill away from not being able to put food on the table. Being in a situation where we have to make a choice between, do we go to the doctors over something that is not necessarily life-threatening, but also not just like a minor thing. Do we make a choice between going to the doctors or paying rent or going to the doctors and eating? That is going to have a significant impact to our needs. And that normally is something that happens over a sustained period of time, especially for certain demographics and certain groups of people. So that is one of those situations where significant and sustained, again, remember, over that period of time, it's going to become more severe as things go. And again, another example is an injury that isn't initially that severe. It's not life and death in that moment, but the effects last over a period of time. So a great example of this was, I don't know whether, I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but a couple of years ago, I actually broke my spine. I fell down the stairs, house sitting for a friend of mine, and it was like being in a vertical car accident, and I actually chipped one of the vertebrae off my spine. Now, if you've ever had a spinal injury, it's not fun. Gonna be honest. And over that period of time that I was actually healing from it, I wasn't able to do the things that I needed to do to be able to support my body, or the things I would normally do. So I'm not practicing yoga, I'm not getting body work, I'm not going to the osteopath, I'm not getting massages, I'm not stretching my body. I wasn't allowed to stretch, wasn't allowed to do any of that. And that happened over that kind of 2-month period while the bone was physically healing. But then second that I was done, that didn't mean everything was like back to normal again. That the issues that I still have some challenges with my back. I have to be very careful. I have to make sure I stretch regularly and move it regularly, because the impact it had to my muscles, how my body compensated over that period of time, it happened over a much more prolonged period, and that prolonged period again increased the severity of the impact to me eventually. So this is something that was like, I mean, most people would say, oh, you broke your back, Claire, that's pretty severe. Yes ish, but no. I can understand why you would think that. The kind of spinal fracture that I had, basically the spine is the vertebrae of the spine looked like this, and I basically chipped the corner of it, which technically counts as a fracture. It technically counts as a break. Luckily, it didn't chip where my spinal cord was. So yes, most people think of that and go, oh my God, that's the worst thing you can do. No, I was very, very lucky that I got away with only a significant injury in that situation, not a severe one.
So now we're going to talk about severe and sustained.
Like 3. No, we did 3 already. 6. We're at 6 now.
So this is a severe trauma, and this is, again, over a long period of time, a prolonged period. So some of the examples we have for this one: a serious accident where severe injuries affect you over a period of time. So if you're in a car crash and you are... let's say you break both legs.
Right.
That is a severe injury that is going to affect you over a period of time. You're going to have to heal from that. You're probably going to have physical therapy from that. There might be long-term effects of that. Like I had a severe injury where I fell down a flight of stairs and snapped my ankle. And I am still to this day dealing with the effects of that. So it is a severe and sustained trauma that had happened.
Right.
Another one is, we talked about the natural disaster. Now, if you're in a natural disaster and you're in an environment where a trauma occurs, so let's say you are, what's coming to me right now is, and you're in the Midwest and there's a tornado and you go into your bunker and then you come out and everything is gone. Your house is gone. Your life as you knew it was gone.
Right.
That is severe and is sustained, because that's not something you can just come back and be like, we cleaned up from the hurricane and we were like, okay, this is a pretty shitty situation. There's a lot to deal with, and we have our homes, we have the basics.
And actually what I want to just jump in with here is that this is recognizing that there are different types of trauma that are happening in the same situation. So there's the severe momentary trauma of like, shit, there is something coming at us, we got to get to shelter. That has an impact. And then the severe trauma of having all of your things no longer being there, and that's going to last over a sustained period. Those are 2 different things. So you can have the people who might go into the bunker, come out and everything's fine. They've got that severe momentary trauma. Then others are going to have had that impact of it affecting their belongings and the things that they have, and they're not having those anymore. That is severe and sustained. So it's recognizing that there are different kinds of trauma, and when you have multiple traumas, they can compound. So it's like they don't just get added together. Like the effect to our needs creates a vulnerability around needs that then means that when other things hit those same needs, we talk about this in the the Same Shit Different Day episode. I think it's in the Burning the Candle at Both Ends series, where we talk about if something gets hit and then something gets hit again in the same place and again in the same place, even if the latter hits are less, the impact to an already vulnerable or already affected area is going to be more. So I think it's recognizing that there are, like, we tend to kind of lump all these things together and go, that was a traumatic event. Well, yes, it might have been a traumatic event, but there were multiple different types of trauma, and how we address those might be different depending on the situation. Sorry, I just had to jump in with that.
Not a problem. The last example I have for this one is an abusive relationship where you're dealing with chronic physical, mental, and or emotional abuse. And this can be any kind of abusive relationship, whether it's a significant other, family abusive. I mean, I think that a lot of times we say abusive relationships and many people have something in their mind that they
think an intimate relationship or a couple, yeah.
And I want to say, like, there are a lot of different kinds of abusive relationships where there is this chronic physical, mental, and or emotional abuse. And I think it's really important to identify that, because a lot of times it's like, well, I know what an abusive relationship is. It doesn't look like this. And yes, that may be the case. And a big and.
Yeah.
It can still be that severe and sustained trauma.
Right. Absolutely. And the reality is that a severe and sustained trauma is just where multiple needs normally are being affected at a severe level over a chronic period of time. So, as Serena said, like earlier, one of the things that's important to recognize is that it's so easy for us to believe that trauma is only trauma if it happens to us. And the truth is that proximity to trauma can create trauma for those in proximity. Like somebody else's trauma can cause trauma for those around them. Now, it doesn't make that person responsible for the trauma going on around them unless they are directly causing it. That's a slightly different thing, of course. But just the mere fact of their trauma can cause trauma for other people. It doesn't mean it's their responsibility, but it is also important. So often we tend to minimize or invalidate our trauma because we're like, oh, well, it's not as bad as so-and-so because they're the one who's actually dealing with it. Your trauma is valid even if somebody else has trauma that is worse. And I think this comparison thing that tends to come up with trauma is like, well, my trauma isn't as bad as their trauma, therefore my trauma, like, I should be fine and I should pretend that I'm okay and I should ignore my trauma or pretend it's not there or gloss over it because it's not as bad as somebody else's. I think that is something that happens so frequently in our society. And the truth is, your trauma is valid. Doesn't matter how big, doesn't matter how small, doesn't matter whether it was sustained or in a single moment of time. Your trauma is valid. And if you are an adult who is able to meet your own needs, it is your responsibility to heal your trauma. Just because you weren't the cause of it does not mean to say that it is not your responsibility. Your needs are your responsibility. Now, does it mean that you might need support? You might need resources? Absolutely. It's not saying you have to do this alone. What we're saying is that if you recognize that you've experienced trauma, and based on what we've shared today, I'm pretty sure that everybody listening will agree, 100% of people have experienced trauma. That's just the reality. It might have only been slight. That's okay. But everyone's going to experience it. The key thing is we need to take responsibility for our healing so that it doesn't continue to affect us. And it also doesn't continue to affect others, because our trauma often informs our behavior towards others. And it is not okay that just because these things have happened to us and we didn't have any control or choice over them does not mean that it's okay that we then pass that on and create this domino effect where other people get traumatized by us and our reaction to that situation. So to give an example of the proximity thing, as I said, like if Serena found out that I was in an accident, like we go back to the truck thing where like she had that thing that affected Serena for two reasons. Well, nuance. There's probably a bunch of different reasons.
I could give you a lot of reasons, but we're already running with this.
Yes. So we'll say a couple of reasons. Like one of them would be like her fear of losing me. But also it could be her fear of her own mortality. She has laid on that beach before, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
I'm like, I would be surprised if you hadn't. Yeah. So it's like, well, it could have happened to her. Could have happened to her husband. Could have happened to, like, there's a number of different things. Serena's trauma is still valid. even though it had nothing to do, it didn't directly impact her. She wasn't the one who had a truck over her head. But her reaction to that and her internalization, the impact it had to her needs, is still valid. And I think that's the thing that I really want to kind of finish up today. I obviously want to check in and see if there's anything you want to add, but I just really want to make sure that we recognize your trauma is valid no matter how big or how small. And if we invalidate our trauma, we don't heal from it. And if we don't heal from it, we carry it forward. And if we carry it forward, it affects us and affects other people around us. And so we have to recognize it as trauma and name it as trauma in order to then do the thing we need to do to heal it. Anything you want to add?
What she said.
That part. Yeah, I think that's just, obviously we've gone in we've gone quite deep in like all of the various some of the various possibilities, because
we'd be here for days,
weeks, months, years, and not still hit all the possibilities that are available. But I think it's really important to recognize that just because somebody else has got severe and sustained trauma doesn't negate the slight trauma that you've had in that moment. And if you dismiss your trauma because somebody else is more severe or more sustained or has a bigger impact to them, then what ends up happening is you don't heal that, and you then carry it with you, and that then will compound over time, and eventually it's all gonna there's going to be a breaking point. Now, whether that breaking point is an emotional breaking point, whether physically there's something happens in your body because your body's like, I can't cope with all this stuff that I've not processed yet, doesn't matter, but it will have an impact eventually. So it's really important for us to recognize what trauma is in order for us to then be able to identify the situations in which we are experiencing trauma. So you're going to get a little bit of insight from today, but in the next episode, we're going to get much deeper into how do I identify trauma? And then the third one is the really exciting one, because that's where we talk about how do you start to heal the trauma. And it's not actually as hard as people think. There's a lot of fear and overwhelm and anxiety around the possibility of facing trauma. But the truth is that actually once you know how to do it, it can be much quicker and easier than people imagine. And so we want to share a little bit of that with you. Anything else you want to share before we carry on?
I'm good.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for being with us today. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. We look forward to speaking to you next time, where we'll be talking more about how to identify trauma. But between now and then, remember to stay safe, take care of yourself, and look for continue to meet your own needs. Lots of love. Bye.
Bye, friends.
That's it for today.
If you like what you heard
and would like to see some of Serena's awesome facial expressions,
check out the video podcast on YouTube.
And remember, if you want to start to heal your trauma, first you need to know what trauma actually is.
Well, shit. It really is that simple.